Right, so hello and welcome to everybody to this December Mission Marketplace, which is all about small groups and the reasons behind small groups and also good work that happens within the small groups. I want to also say hello to everybody who is joining us on the YouTube, watching this back. I'm glad you found us on the Darlington Methodist District YouTube channel. Like I said, it will be focusing on small groups, and I've invited along some people to speak about their experience. I have John Henry from Super from Cleveland and Danby Circuit, and he's going to talk about his experience, his previous appointment and here as well. And then I have Vanessa and John Purdy, who will speak about their experience of small groups and their wonderful work that happens through small groups, really. So I'm really grateful that you've been able to make it to this session this morning. Like I said, this will be turned into a resource. Please share it with everybody, let people know, and hopefully it's benefit to all of you who are watching. So let's explore first then little reasons behind the small groups and perhaps redefine the meaning as well. And I'm going to share my screen for that. So house churches, cell groups, small groups, there are probably many other names. Any contemporary expression of a small group structures represent the continuation of a principle that was central to the work of John Wesley. It was one of the original markers of Methodist identity, an emphasis on community as a key element of the Christian life goes back to the New Testament times. And the Apostle Paul said, so in Christ, we who are many from one body and each member belongs to others. What it was meaning is that Christians are members of one of another in the body of Christ. Now, to fully understand Paul's statement here, it's necessary to realize that Paul's converts actually met in small groups in the size that could fit in a front room. Paul's teachings on the church as the body of Christ and on being one in Christ was about more than just a mystical doctrine. It was actually a way of life. Now, it concerned that very practical, down-to-earth reality of being communities bound together in love, and that's actually the key here. So what about the small groups in Methodism? It's the fellowship that Christians share and the practical outworking of that fellowship in the Christian life that small group settings offer. John Wesley very clearly understood the lives of Christians are best nurtured in a Christian community in which each is responsible for the well-being of others and is accountable to others. In Wesley's opinion, which was borne out in practice in the growth of Methodism, small groups provided the most reliable means of making this kind of Christian community a reality. Now, I've been told that some time ago in Methodism, when you joined the church, that there were classes that you got put in, and there was a class leader, and the class leader was somebody who was looking after you. But also there was that element of accountability to one another. Now, I wonder who is looking out for us today. John Wesley insisted that there could be no such thing as solitary Christian religion. So he based this on Galatians 6:10, which says, therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all people, and especially to those who belong to the family of believers. He said, also John Wesley said, that there is no holiness but social holiness. And small groups provide opportunities to work for the good of our fellow Christians, both spiritually and also materially. But for Methodists, following Wesley's teachings, small groups cannot just be inwardly focusing self-help groups. Whether or not small groups have an explicit focus on social justice, in some way or another, they will have an outward focus and be concerned for the good of all. Now, perhaps Wesley's teaching is something which can and should be claimed, and were necessarily reclaimed as part of the Methodist way of life today. Now, our calling, there's a second element that says, which is the learning and caring, and it says the church exists to help people to grow and learn as Christians through mutual support and care. So small groups are especially important in providing that mutual support and care. Now, when starting a small groups, there are possibly some of the questions that really needs to be asked, kind of to give it some meaning and kind of understanding why we starting a small group and why we doing this. So first question I would say would be, who is it for? So you would need to kind of think through, is it for folk at the church who've been going to church for many, many years? Or is it for people who have come through the doors of the church, so new believers? Is it for a specific age group? So there are several questions that you can kind of put under this heading, but who is it for? Then what would be the purpose of this group? Is it the study of the Bible? Is it to do theology? Is it to grow and then go out in mission? Is it to befriend the folk in the local community and understand their context and then come together in small groups? So it's good to kind of look ahead what we're trying to achieve in this. And then, is the group for the whole circuit or a single church? I'm come from a teaching background, so I would always say, what would be the outcome if all take part in a Bible study, for example, in a whole circuit context? Then you can tell that people will arrive in a place together having learned the same material. So, for example, like Holy Habits or Methodist way of life groups, can encourage greater discipleship and understanding that word and works go together. And you need to decide, are you want to doing this the whole circuit level with everybody involved, or on a single church level by helping them to meet their need, or so on. So there's several questions, but what about the whole overall picture and the outcome? And then number 4, how long will the group run? Now in Methodism, we've had all sorts of drop-in Bible studies come our way, especially when we look at our church calendar. So there could be an Advent study or a Lent study or Pentecost, or you name it, we have that. And these are just kind of moments of spiritual injection, I guess, into a discipleship, somebody's life who's a disciple. But also there are groups that run for years, and it can be because the people gel so well together and they enjoy doing theology together. But it's thinking about how long will the group run. And there's nothing wrong with how long it runs. It's just options here. And then finally, what is the focus of the group? And while all groups will involve some kind of meeting, praying and loving, their expressions can be very different. And also in the Darlington district, I have noticed that there are many different types of small groups. And even in my ministry, I have been part of in very different types of small groups. So for example, we have the obvious Bible study groups. These focus on the study of the Bible and approach it in a variety of ways. This could be foundational for perhaps other expressions of small groups. So, for example, using a specific Bible study method to learn about a specific passage in the Bible or a whole book or so on. Then we have fresh expressions groups. I've been part of one of those who met in a pub on a Sunday, gathering people who felt frightened actually to go to church for some reason. But these are new ways of being church and kind of looking for other spaces where people can meet. And it's about changing the culture. And usually the change happens from small to large. So small groups in fresh expressions ways. And then we have seeker groups. These are groups such as those that meet for the Alpha course, for example. These are specifically designed to give spiritual seekers an opportunity and find out more about Christian faith. And they are often church-based and can run for a limited period of time, with obviously offered extensions then. And then we have support groups. These offer support and Christian fellowship and come in all shapes and sizes. Often they focus on shared interests and activities and tend to attract people within the church community. So for example, like Knit and Natter, there are specific groups for men, or there are specific groups for women. You name it, you've probably been part of one of those. Then we have social justice groups. These groups have an explicit focus on loving the community and reaching out to it. They can be church-based, but they are usually based within the community or an organization that is working within the community. So, for example, like Christian aid groups or Salvation Army, actually, I noticed comes under this, and Mercy, Ships, and Mission Without Borders. And I'm sure there are a few others you can name. And then finally, spirituality and discipleship groups. These tend to focus on spiritual growth or a growth in discipleship, and they use specific resources to help them in that task. They may also have a focus on exploring Christian vocation within the world, but discipleship tends to be the key emphasis here. So, for example, again, we've heard of Holy Habits, but also Methodist Way of Life. Study groups help this, and also in the district we have an Acorn group, which meets with one another, but in the meantime they pray to ask who God would like them to reach out to in their community. I have notes on what I'm saying today, which I'm more than happy to kind of share with everybody. It's just let me know if you would like me to send these out to you, because in my notes also I have some resources put in there as well, so where you can find resources for each different type of group, basically. There are, of course, overlaps between these different groups, you know, and no doubt there are other kinds of groups that could also be mentioned here as well. All groups really should include time to meet and pray together and help support members to reach out in love in their community. The bottom line is that the outcome for these groups is a greater spiritual understanding of how God works in us and through us in this world. It will definitely bring people together. Okay, right, I would like to now turn to John Henry, if that's okay with you, John. Could you please tell us about your experience and what have you learned and what did, you know, people...
Yes, certainly, Helen. I'm going to talk to you a bit about cell church, but later on I'm going to just question the use of that term a little bit. The way I'm going to speak with you this morning and offer some thoughts is I'm going to talk to you about my own journey working within small group work, really starting in cell church and then moving on to different thinking about all that. Then I'm going to talk about a sense of consolidation of thinking. So how I came to a place of thinking that this is a really good way of growing the church, and then to talk about what I'm going to call aspirational ecclesiology, and I'll come back to that. So what I found is in my work, this all started way back when I was a minister in Liverpool, and what I was finding is that we weren't really growing as churches. And the same old thinking was producing the same old results. And so I got round to thinking, and through some reading about cell church, I want to just share a book that I'm reading at the moment. Actually, this is my current reading, and it's from a guy called Bob Jackson. And this book's called What Makes Churches Grow, and he talks about growth in three ways: growing in depth in spirituality, growing in vitality, in other words, how effective we are in terms of our mission. And Bob Jackson makes the point that when you grow in depth spiritually and when you grow in vitality, you will also start to see growth numerically. And he says all three things are very important. And I guess that was in my thinking way back in the late 90s, and into the beginning of this current century. So just a bit of a journey. In 2003 and 4, in Liverpool South Circuit, I began to think about cell church with a colleague who's Reverend Dr. Andrew Fox, who is now up in the Shetlands actually, and we set up a cell church conference in the winter of 2004. And concurrent to that, I was also very often leading worship in one of my churches in St. Peter's in Toxteth, and very often there'd be probably 5 of us in the congregation on a Sunday evening, and I actually threw a normal pattern of doing worship out the window, and we started to work within the church, albeit we were in a sanctuary, but using a small group model. And I found that people were really growing through that model of church. Concurrently to all of that, Reverend Marion Proud, in little did I know it at that time, a probation in Holsworthy Circuit, was starting to get that circuit thinking about cell church. A friend who was a presbyter in South Chadderton Methodist Church, which at that time was I don't know that it still is, but was based on small group work. I started having conversations with him, and so it was that in 2004 and stationing, I expressed an interest in cell church and small group work as a way of doing church. And lo and behold, I was stationed to Holsworthy Circuit. So I would say stationing committees do sometimes listen. And so in Holsworthy Circuit, there was an ongoing journey. So when we arrived, there were about 4 to 5 people growing, together in a small group, and that group grew to 14. And then in 2005, not long after we'd arrived, actually, we started looking at splitting that group of 14, splitting or multiplying, to use the technical speak of cell church, into 2 new groups. Then in 2009, another new cell church started, and I have to say failed after just a couple of months, because I think looking back on it, reflecting back on that journey, it was because they didn't really get what we were trying to do and to achieve through that. But I'll go on to talk about another one that did become quite successful. In the spring of 2011, my wife had a vision for starting a church group plant in a pub in Holsworthy called the White Hart, using some material called Community Bible Study. And that's what happened. And again, that was really based on small group work, but albeit we met as a larger congregation to begin with, we then went off into small groups to talk about the biblical material we're looking at. Wendy also began a small group in the manse as a result of that. And what was really interesting is that at that time, let me just roll back a moment, that the church plant in the White Hart pub, we took the decision one summer to kind of have a summer break. And what we found is we couldn't, because people were saying, this is my church, this is where I go to church. And so in fact we just carried on. So there was a sense in which that small group ministry was a real church. Just to say that by the time we left Devon to come here, there were about 60 people in small group work, really growing together and growing in their discipleship together. And I began to see that as a real place of renewal and reform, somewhere where the church could be renewed through that particular ministry. And ever since then, I've been absolutely committed to the work of small group work. I want to just finish this part by talking to you about a little church I talked about one cell church that failed. Now I'm going to talk about one that bore great fruit. So this is Ashwater Methodist Church in very, very rural Devon. And one day we came to our church council and the treasurer said, I can either pay the assessment or the insurance. I can't pay both. And so going round the church council, one after another of them said, we think it's time we close. And what I said to them, you may feel it's time to close this building, but have you thought about doing church in a different way? And to cut long story short, we ended up having a small group church in one of the members' homes. So that kind of grew, and people grew in their discipleship with each other. And again, when we left Devon to come here, that group was still very strong and growing. And so I said that the second thing I wanted to do was to talk about how I've consolidated my thinking. The more and more I've thought about this, the more I've prayed about it, the more it seems to me to be one of the tools in our tool chest for growing the church. And so many years ago now, I actually broke my most of my academic work has been in New Testament work, but actually broke with that for a time and looked into Wesleyan theology and started to really dig deep into Wesleyan theology. And I have to say, to reiterate what Hella said, you know, it is deep within our DNA to be a small group church, to have small groups. A key text, recommend a book to you, a book by a chap called Michael Henderson, called A Model for Making Disciples. And he looks at John Wesley's class system and pulls out of that some really key thinking. And so this is within that book. George Whitfield apparently came across a certain John Poole and he said, well, John, art thou still Wesleyan? Poole replied, yes, sir, and I thank God that I have the privilege of being in connection with him and one of his preachers. And this was what Whitfield said: John, you're in the right place. My brother Wesley acted wisely. The souls that were awakened under his ministry, he joined in classes and thus preserved the fruits of his labour. This I neglected, and my people are a rope of sand. Never really understood what a rope of sand meant, but I'm assuming it means something that's quite negative. And the other thing to say is that Wesley went through what he called the great experiment. And this is what he says: we've made the trial. And that trial was dropping the class meetings in various places. But in all of them, the seed has fallen by the highway side. There is scarce any fruit remaining. And this is what Michael Henderson says about Wesleyan DNA in terms of small group. As the architect of a well-disciplined movement, he was able to assimilate large population blocks into his organization in a short time, train them effectively in the rudiments of Christian discipleship, and mobilize them into an ardent core of social change agents. Bit of a mouthful, bit wordy, but basically what he's saying is that small group work, cell church, class meetings, created a way of being. And again, just to sort of say that's massively within our DNA as the Methodist folk. Big difference between the society and band. Band was an even smaller group than the class meeting. Difference between society and band is that within society, within what we would call congregation, church, as we know it on a Sunday morning, there was input of knowledge. Within the band, the emphasis was on behavioural change. in the society professional leadership, in the band lay leadership, in the society leader as instructor, in the band leader as enabler, facilitator, in society kind of lecture, sermon, teaching, in the band mutual interaction. I'm going to skip over this actually. These are 8 guiding principles. Just skip over them very quickly. Just to say that, you know, these were the things that were behind that sort of thinking, that human nature is perfectible by God's grace, and that comes through working together in accountability in the small group. Learning comes by doing the will of God. Again, that comes in time and working together in our discipleship. Human nature is perfected by participation in groups, not by individualism. Going back to what Hella said, no individual Christianity, rather, more so social Christianity, working together. The spirit and practice of primitive Christianity, again, small group work, house churches, can and must be recaptured. Human progress will occur if we participate in the means of grace. And one of the means of grace was the small group. Gospel must be presented to the poor. Again, part of that was the small group. Social evil is not to be resisted but overcome with good. And then just to say that the primary function of these groups was to note the typo, is to equip. It should read is to equip others to lead and minister, not to perform the ministry personally. And so I've read loads and loads. Phil Potter's The Challenge of Cell Church, really good book. Body and Cell by Howard Astin, talking about how he enabled a church in Bradford to transition to cell church. And then this is an absolute classic, William Beckham, Bill Beckham's book, The Second Reformation, looking at small group work. And all that's enabled me to kind of consolidate my thinking in terms of how I see the church moving. I guess to go, third thing that I said I'd speak about is an aspirational ecclesiology. I would love to see more small group work in our churches, because I do believe it's the place where we do grow. You will have noticed that I've moved to the term small group. We set up a group in Gisborough of young folk, you know, 20 plus 30-year-olds. We started off calling it a cell group, but 1 or 2 of them didn't like that, because it was at the time when you know, that terrorists were gathering in cells and creating terror cells, and they didn't like that language. So we ended up calling our group a life group. Since then, we've created an Inspire band, which there's just 4 of us sharing together in a sense of mutual accountability. And I do believe, absolutely do believe, that small group work can be missional. You know, if we move beyond just, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with small groups for Bible study and fellowship, but I do believe that there is a missional focus to be discovered through small groups. Just looking at some of the things that have come recently, when I first arrived here, we looked at Robert Schnee's 5 practices of fruitful congregations: radical hospitality, passionate worship, intentional faith development, risk-taking mission and service, and extravagant generosity. And I believe you could do all those 5 things through small group work. So just to conclude, I believe, a bit out of a sense of experience, that cell groups, small groups do work. People grow in their discipleship in small groups, that there is an accountability for discipleship in small groups. No one size fits all. Gisborough Methodist Church is a has been a growing church. And I would say that one of the reasons for that is its small group work. But if you were to go across all the different small groups at Gisbury, you would find they are very, very different. There are some that are just support groups, fellowship groups. There are some that join together for Bible study. Some are accountability groups, mutual accountability for discipleship. So I don't think that one size fits all. I think we've got to kind of bring the changes. And so that's me done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. Very interesting. We'll come to the questions at the end of this. So yeah, but thank you for doing your presentation at this point. Vanessa and John Purdy, it's your turn now. I think I forgot to say before that you actually are in Bishop Auckland and Shildon circuit in Darlington district. So over to you.
Yeah, we're currently in Bishop Auckland, and not a terribly pleasant day out there, but it is lovely to be with you. A little bit of my background: I'm from the Irish Church, grew up in Northern Ireland, part of Mid-Ulster, very Protestant evangelical background, young people's Christian endeavour, through the junior Christian endeavour and then into the young people's Christian endeavour, and groups, almost small groups together for prayer, Bible study, fellowship, discipleship. Went off to university, arrived in Bradford, was part of a Meth-Soc group, and again living in a Meth-Soc house for a couple of years with a couple of other guys. It became a small group, and whenever exams were failed, it was a way of pastoral support and care for one another, but it was also a way of shaping direction into ministry, and first hearing the call to preach and going on note as a local preacher in the Great Horton Circuit in Bradford, and that was all possible through small groups, and Meth-Soc being that group. Went from that into being back to Ireland, to being part of a youth team that travelled the Irish Connection. And again, it was a group of 4 of us who lived together, prayed together, worshipped together, and led youth work and churches for a year's service. And that was so important in my spiritual development. So from all of that, kind of grew up with this idea of being in groups that would encourage and lead folk forward in their faith, in their practice of the Christian way of life in whatever way, and experienced others who were on that journey with me, others in the Young People's Christian Endeavour group who are now Methodist ministers in the Irish Connection, others who are youth workers in England, and others through that youth team in Ireland who are now pastors and leaders of churches in Britain, in Ireland and America. It works and it leads folk through, and it encourages those of us in it. During lockdown, it is great. I've just had communication with my young goddaughter, and she is the daughter of 2 friends who were with me at university in Bradford. We kept in touch with them. Now I'm godfather to their youngest daughter, and she's now done her A-levels and moving on, and the connections stay because of the depth of trust and prayer and being there for one another. And even though we might have been on different islands for 20 years, the prayerful connection was still there. So in Ireland, and I'll pass over to Vanessa. Vanessa joined me in Ireland, and she's from Sunderland originally, and we found ourselves in a district that was visited by Phil Meadows and the Inspire movement, and Vanessa will take up the story.
Yes, while we were there and that was going on, we talked a couple of our ladies to go, or I talked to a couple of our ladies to go up to the Inspire meetings. Districts are much bigger over in Ireland, so we were travelling for about an hour and a quarter to go up to the centre of the district, as it were. And so we always had good chats in the car. And there were 3 or 4 of us that went up each couple of weeks, every month or so, something like that. The 2 ladies that went with me at that time, that I can remember definitely being there every single time, neither of them would have been confident at really speaking about faith. And definitely, when we were in Bible study setting, wouldn't have prayed aloud without having written their prayer down beforehand. Phil always did a teaching session, and then he would put having spoken about how these bands were supposed to be working and being accountable. You're in a group of 3 or 4, accountable to each other, working through questions, a bit like the Methodist way of life. We had to pray with one another at the end, and he dropped it on us the first time, and I can remember the 2 of them just kind of, how can I say anything? I mean, yes, I'm used to praying out loud and have been in lots of different prayer triplets and things like that over the years, but these 2 ladies hadn't, and their prayers that very first time were extremely short and very nervous, but they agreed to have a go. As I say, I think there was maybe another person with us. We weren't always just 3 of us, but it's the story of these 2 ladies that I want to share with you. And so we were going up quite a few times, and the fellowship in the car, and talking about the nerves of sharing faith, as well, sharing the personal faith, not who you're sharing it with, but just speaking about faith. And as we were getting then encouraged to set up bands, John said to me, you don't want to be in a band with these couple of ladies, because we'll be moving on not too long later, but they also need to learn their own expression that can be grounded there. So yes, we were a small group in the car going up, but when we were formally into an Inspire band, I was with another clergy wife, and these 2 ladies drew in another lady, and they became an Inspire band themselves. So we didn't hear or see what was going on within the band. And
yet we could see the fruits of that band.
That was what I was going to say.
Dorothy started local preacher training, and Marie thought about it and stood in the pulpit and did a little thing, and then decided that wasn't for me, but she became the support for Dorothy to go through all the training. And Dorothy didn't have the confidence because being a farmer's wife, poor schooling, busy background, never seeing herself as one of the educated folk who were in pulpit. She needed Marie to be that prayerful encouragement, to test out things with Marie on her journey into preaching. And therefore, that band has produced a wonderful result, but it needs both Dorothy in the pulpit delivering and Marie, the prayerful support and encouragement behind it as it's gone through.
And that was just really the result of that. For myself, I really appreciated being in the band. And we didn't sit at home, myself and Jan. We would go walking and talk and pray. And that was our way of doing it. And when we first came here, and I didn't have that anymore, I missed it. And so when Methodist Way of Life has come in, and John got excited about that, saying, this could do for the Bishop Auckland circuit, or Bishop Auckland and Shildon circuit, or our experience of it, what Inspire Bands did for Dorothy and Marie and others up in Donegal. And so he had the vision, even during lockdown and pandemic and everything else, you can't wait until all the resources are produced. If they're talking at conference about setting up small groups, then we need to actually get on and do it. And he wasn't ready to wait. He said, we'll go and we'll have a go and set it up. And he encouraged me to set up with a couple of lady local preachers from the circuit. And he had a go with a couple of the male stewards.
Men is always more difficult, I think. when we're more hesitant in getting into a group, and we're slower to open and build up trust. Therefore, I found it better to be living in a student house with folk that the trust developed over many more months, and over doing practical things rather than sitting down with Bibles open on our laps. And for the men's group that we started in the summer with a couple of stewards, and one of them quite quickly said, "This isn't for me." And I recognize it's not for everybody. And some of our leaders give very faithfully and lead the church in many different ways, but they're just not in the social place or have the personality to kind of fit in and give and also to receive in a small group setting. So, and it's having the freedom to say, right, that's not for you, and we bless you as you leave us. But we'll invite somebody else in who said yes. And now with two folk who really do love to chat, and they're exploring with one another, they're testing and debating the Bible, and we're moving forward with that.
Yeah.
And having a positive group that works like that, then hopefully they can share their experience and find other groups.
Yeah.
But there will be some folk for whom, no, this isn't for us.
Yeah. With the ladies group, we met in the garden, where we could meet in the garden, and then now we've moved on to Zoom, working through a lot of kind of just talking together about faith, with knowing that we're all of faith. We start with a prayer, we end with a prayer. We often just talk about what's been troubling us for a while, but then we tackle one of the questions, and at the end of the session we read the Methodist Way of Life commitment together, and we make sure we read it aloud, even though on Zoom it just is a cacophony of noise. But it's important to do that, to be anchored into some kind of a system which also encourages us to be accountable to one another and say, we've been praying about that for you for the last couple of weeks. How's it going? And that kind of question is starting to come up as well. But moving through the questions will mean that at some point we'll come to the end of all the questions. And I think at that point, the group needs to multiply, to use John's term. So that we've actually grow our own groups in our own places, because we're all 3 different churches.
The final experience that we have of it is we have 6 young people that help us put together worship on a Thursday and Sunday, and radio and YouTube, and they all have gifts and abilities, and they're brilliant young people. We pay them a little bit. It's the continuation of the district's mini one-up program. So we crack the whip and say part of your hours and part of the contract is you will once a month join together on Teams, not only to talk about what you're doing and preparing the devotions, but you will spend some time doing the Methodist Way of Life, talking to one another through that. We don't join them from that, they do it, but one of the group report back to us, or to Vanessa as line manager, that exercise has been completed. They have met together in teams that month, and whether it be 5 of them and one of them not available because of exams or revision or other things, but they report back, yes, we have met, and we feel that's important in their spiritual development, for them to not only work together, but be able in their own way to share questions and faith and doubts.
Yeah, and support one another in prayer, to actually practice the prayer, what they're talking about and sharing, and we're encouraging them to express their faith, but also to experience that supportive, prayerful, carrying one another as a small group.
So that's our experience. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It is much appreciated to, that you're able to come and share with us. There's some very practical points that you have made, which I'm sure that will be very useful for everybody. At this point, I wonder if anybody would like to ask any questions about what you've heard so far, and maybe want to explore a theme a bit further.
Just for John and Vanessa, there's talk about group work not being for everybody, and I'm thinking a lot about small groups in a lot of different contexts and for different purposes. But when you say it's not for everybody, what would you suggest in terms of making sure those people are not lost entirely to the faith, or are they left to their own devices to make sure they grow in faith?
At the moment, we've been working with folk within the church and key leaders.
Sorry.
So I hope they're not lost to the church and lost to faith. But it's recognizing that the Methodist way of life, as we have had it, and the spiritual conversations and the way of doing it, and it's a little bit different. We met once or twice in a church lounge, socially distanced by 2 meters and masks and all that, and then by Zoom. I'm not sure if that was part of his decision not to continue, and whether if we had more the men's way of doing things, like men's sheds, if we'd been able to kind of have a mug of tea in a shed with the church lawnmower and discuss things as we went about practical things. I think small groups may be suitable for everybody, but it's, as John Henry and others have said, it's the nature of that group. At the moment, we haven't been able to do a sort of group in the way that he would feel comfortable, where the others now, meeting with myself, are comfortable chatting on Zoom and talking about their prayer life and doing that, face to face. And it's quite intimidating in Zoom whenever you see a large face up there and somebody's listening intently to you about what you get out of prayer or what you get out of worship. So I recognize it's not quite for everybody at the moment. The more men's sheds, practical expression and doing things alongside one another, and then dropping the spiritual accountability and prayer into that might be a better way forward.
I just would like to echo that. I mentioned Phil Potter. Phil Potter is a Church of England clergyman in, well, the last I knew, he was in St Mark's in Haydock in Merseyside. And I heard him speak at a Cell Church conference one time, talking about how one of his groupings within St Mark's was a little craft group, predominantly ladies, I have to say, but how they actually kind of almost intuitively created a sense of cell. There was a sense of community in that group, and before long they were, albeit in an implicit way and in a gentle way, talking about spiritual things. And the important thing was that a group had formed in community and were growing together in a gentle way of discipleship. And that really struck home to me. And I've found that in one or two places where groups that you wouldn't call cell or a small group ministry actually are, but implicitly so.
Yeah, thank you for that. I mean, there's a question about, there are loads of groups that just meet to just gather and do something together, but there is no spiritual element. And I know that over the years there's been the difficulty of how do you kind of insert that spiritual element into there as well. So would you have any advice on how to turn that around so that, people understand that actually we're also here to grow together spiritually? You're muted, John.
I was going to say I need to think about that. I'm just trying to draw on experience. I'll maybe come back to that question in a moment or two.
No, that's fine. That is a difficult question, and I've had many people kind of ask that. It's almost changing the purpose of, not a purpose, but if you come together to just knit, then the question of how we insert spirituality in there you know, that kind of changes that, doesn't it? So we're knitting, but now we're doing Bible study as well, or something along those lines, you know. That's, I mean, while you kind of think about that, one of the things that I'm picking up from here is the courage, first of all, to start something like this, kind of put it out there and say, here is a small group opportunity, and kind of having that courage to wait who's going to respond to that type of small group setting. But also then having that on the side, knowing that actually it can fail and that's okay. So anything, Vanessa, you want to add to that one? What would you say about failing? How would you deal with that?
I think you've got to allow things to, if a group fails because somebody doesn't want to be part of it, then that's got to be allowed and be seen, as John said, to be something that you can just say, okay, that's fine, we bless you, if you don't feel this is for us. Not to feel that the group has failed, or the person who doesn't feel it's for them has failed, because they've had a go. And if you want to walk on water, you've got to get out of the boat, even if you sink. It's got to be possible. So, and you just pick yourself up as the two who remained in the group did, and put the word out. Look, is there somebody who would like to join the group, or have a think together? Who could be part of the group instead? Who would help the dynamic? And then it goes. Certainly, the way that the groups that we formed were by invitation and kind of thinking who would benefit from being in the group, because we wanted triplets. And I can see the two ladies who are working with me go, if they want to carry on with it, kind of saying, okay, who would I like to share with and model this fantastic way of working with in my own setting, and going, and then I would kind of think, okay, who else could I invite into a group who might benefit of learning this way of being accountable? And in so doing, they multiply. But I don't know how successful they are top down. It's kind of going from the grassroots up that really kind of, to me, makes it successful. And in prayer together, doing that. And I think if you try and impose groups on people, they may not be as successful.
No.
And John probably has more experience of that than I do in that way. But certainly the ones that we've done where it's been organic and by invitation and growing in that way, you win some, you lose some, but you don't damage the relationships by trying in that way.
I think I can sort of, you know, in a way I can answer the two questions that have been posed. I talked about Ashwater Methodist Church, the similar experience with another Methodist church called Tetcott Methodist Church, once again deepest rural Devon, and that church was the church that failed in a sense, because again we were half a dozen people, and I said to them, instead of meeting in the church, let's go in the schoolroom. I'll bring my guitar, we'll have a time of doing things differently. Didn't like it, couldn't care for it, wanted what they considered to be real church back. And so one day, as part of my sermon and as part of my own giving, it was the text was on the parable of the talents, you know. And what I did was I actually said to them, as part of my giving, I'm going to give you this 20 quid note, and I want you to transform this £20 note into something else. And what they did was they ran with that, and they were all into kind of singing, and each Christmas tide they did a really big concert that involved singing a lot of stuff, really spiritual stuff. They ran with that and made a video of it and kind of sold the video here, there and everywhere for a charity. And in that there was a small group that grew out of that you know, out of that little exercise. The difference was, going back to what Vanessa's just said, it wasn't top down, it was something they grew themselves, and and it just took off. But again, I want to say that within that there was community and an implicit and gentle spirituality. I think, again, Rick Warren, I love Rick Warren. His famous book is Purpose Driven Church, and he talks about failing fast. And by that he means, you know, keep on trying new stuff. If it doesn't work, try something else. Fail fast.
Thank you, John. Yeah, I wondered if there is also the element of, you know, giving the control totally to God. We kind of, as humans, want to create these things and think this is what we need, and it probably is. We do need to meet and kind of grow spiritually, but how these things come about is about how the Holy Spirit is kind of organizing these things, and then seeing the pockets. Oh yeah, there's an opportunity here. Can we offer an opportunity here? Can we offer an opportunity here? So there's a much bigger picture, isn't there, in terms of how these things kind of develop. I know from my experience, I run a small group as well, Bible study group, and we do theology in a very different way that's normally known. And there's been people dipping in and out. There is a core group, but there are people who are like, oh yeah, I want to be part of this, and then realize how we do it is not suitable for them, or I don't know, they have to kind of actually come and contribute as well in terms of having studied something before they come and so on. And not everybody likes that. I mean, the problem is I always make cake and we can't have cake at the moment. So I wonder whether, but anyway, that's just a joke there. But yeah, it is exactly, people come and test these things out as well and kind of see what suits them and what doesn't. Yeah. Do we have any other questions about anything we've heard this morning? That's great. I mean, if you want to speak to John Henry or John and Vanessa Purdy about anything in detail, then I'm sure they're happy to be contacted and you can have a quick phone chat with them about that. But I mean, I just want to say thank you to everybody for joining us this morning. If you've been a presenter, thank you so much for taking out time from your busy schedule and sharing with everybody. But also if you've come and listened and heard what's been said and kind of put that behind your ear, I thank you for coming as well on this Saturday morning. I want to finish this session by saying a breakthrough prayer. I'm hoping that you've kind of heard that in many contexts at the moment, but I shall pray. God of love, God for all, your purposes are more beautiful than we can possibly imagine. Fill us with your Holy Spirit. Help us let go of all that holds us back. Open our lives and our churches to new seasons of humility and faith, of change and growth. Shake us up with the good news of Jesus and show us the way. Amen.